It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Tess back to the Slade, because she was head of graduate painting here for a large number of years. In fact, she started teaching at the Slade in 1968 and left in 1999. Incredibly influential on the place. I first encountered her at the Whitechapel Art Gallery. She had an amazing show with Mark Vaux of gigantic abstract paintings of whizzing triangles. It was a very, very beautiful show, and I never knew in those days, I was very young, I never knew people made paintings like that. It was very inspirational. And then, to my amazement, she interviewed me to come to the Slade as well. So we go back a long way. I also taught with her in graduate painting. So I've known Tess a really long time. But that's not why she's here. She's here because she's an astounding artist. And some of the things, as I said, she had a solo show at the Whitechapel. She's got a show at the moment in Norwich East with Alison Wilding. She had a show in 1988 at the Serpentine. In another show, 2014, Jernogoli and Nottingham. She's had numerous shows. She's in many public collections, such as the Tate, Arts Council, British Museum. And she's done many public commissions, the British Embassy in Moscow, in Birmingham Centenary Square. She also has written widely. She's written a wonderful book called The Blue Cupboard about, she may read from it, and Mysteries and Confessions. And she was made a Royal Academician in 2010. Anyway, welcome, Tess. Wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Andy. I said to Andy if he could make that as long as possible, then it really means I have to talk for much less time. When he first asked me kindly to come and give a talk, I was actually very hesitant because I have been away from the Slade now for many years. I was here for a very long time, and they were absolutely wonderful years, and I do have this odd feeling that somehow Slade students are the backbone of British art. Please don't quote me outside here. Anyhow, as you probably know, he's very persuasive. And he said that it'll be very informal. And I am impressed to see so many people, because when I was running postgraduate, if I wanted more than 5 people to come to a talk, I had to go and pay them £10 each. So this is very impressive to see so many. The first thing I thought of was, what would I call it? And I came up with a series of titles, all of which, in a way, would perhaps in themselves say more about my position and the work than talking about it. The one was Coming at a Tangent, because I think that I'm someone that does their work indirectly. Making Connections, very, very important. Trying to Make Sense, which I suppose many of you are trying to do now. Don't count on getting there. Looking Back. What, How, Why, which was something I thought about a lot as a student. You know, what to paint, how do you paint, and why are you doing it, which is, you know, a question that really has gone on all my life. And then, last of all, I thought from an anti-theory perspective, because I have talked with many, many young artists, all of who've been persuaded that that is the way to go. And I'm not saying it's not the way to go, but it is another language, and sometimes I think it can interfere with the creative act. But those of you that are thrilled by theory, you'll go on. So I came up with the title Watching Paint Dry, which is what happens to interest me most at the moment. I've gone back to oil paint after many years of doing other things than using oil. And to my sadness, in a way, I've discovered there is nothing like it. It is the most wonderful medium, and in many ways the most difficult. And surface has become for me very, very, very important, and I can't quite understand what that importance is, other than that one can say possibly that everything is surface, that is, everything we look at, everything we're looking at now is actually just surface. For all I know, none of you have anything behind you, and that is very interesting. And I have rather bad light in my studio, and I get up in the middle of the night sometimes and I get a torch and I look at the surfaces of my paintings to see how they're drying. And those of you who use oil paint know there's absolutely nothing you can do to speed that up. It will dry as long as it takes, whatever you mix with it. Then I had another idea, which in some ways I think is the best. Somebody told me that, or maybe Martin Creed told me, I'm assuming you all know Martin Creed's work. Somebody told me that he was asked to do a lecture here, and he came in, and for an hour he got on the table and went to sleep for an hour. And I was deeply impressed by that. I thought that just must have taken huge courage. I wondered what the students did. I thought, did they feel trapped? Had I been a parent of a student, I would have wanted my money back, I think. But as far as I know, they sat it out. And that did interest me a lot. And I thought, well, what I could do is to bring in a painting that is drying and force everybody to sit here and watch it dry for an hour. And it would have saved me quite a lot of trouble, actually, and you, for that matter. But I haven't had the courage to do that, so I haven't done it. So it's possible that you've come here to listen to an older artist who will tell you what to do and will help you see into the future as to what it means to be an artist. I can't help you there. This is a mystery that goes on all one's life. My own view is the only people who should be making art are those who simply can't do anything else. It's too difficult otherwise. Because in the end, you don't really come up with any answers. All you have is questions. But the questions go on, and that is, I think, what is so interesting for me anyhow. Whether you're faced with a canvas or a sculpture or a computer or an idea, it is always the idea of, what happens if I do this? What happens if I do that next? And you never know until you do it. So you think as much with your hands as with your head. You can ask what every work means to you. You can say, is every work a discovery, or is it a diary, or is it uncovering of facts? And if it's a revelation to you, what does it reveal to others, and how important is that? Those are the kind of questions one has to ask, and very, very often you don't know. You just, you're kind of reaching out in the dark. So what I would like to do is to go through some slides. I've got 20 or 30 slides. I have been working for 6 decades, and I could only pick some almost arbitrarily, just to give you an idea of the kind of questions that I've been involved with. And then I hope that you will ask questions and that we can have some kind of discussion, because I'm actually very interested in how things have changed and what your views are and where you see art and where you see yourself going. And I made some notes as to what I see as having changed. I wrote, so much seems to change so fast in the perception of art. Now form has become object, idealization has become selection, discordance has become concordance, pain has become pleasure. Incoherence is now coherence, imperfection now perfection. And God help those artists who think in terms of soul or harmony or beauty. So that was my statement. Before I show you slides, I'm going to read from this book, which was published last year, I think. Anybody's got a lot of money. It's not selling very well, so I think it's about £15 from Amazon, so anybody who wants to buy it, please do buy it. It's various essays on various things, some about my family, some about art, and one of the pieces I wrote about the Slade when I was a student, which is from 1957, however many years ago that is. And I thought if I read it, I'd have it all there rather than just be able to try and remember. You may find this boring, but it's possible in 50 or 60 years' time, some of you will be doing exactly the same. You will say what the Slade was like. What was the Slade like in 2016? Can I remember? Am I getting paid properly for this? And so on. So anybody can have a nap if they find somebody reading boring. In 1957, London was still a post-war city. Piles of fallen houses were part of the landscape, and the landscape itself around University College, of which the Slade School of Fine Art was the left wing, belonged more to the Bloomsbury of the 1920s and 30s than the freedom of the 60s, which was inconceivable then. We were younger in age than students are now, at least the girls were. Many of the boys had spent 2 years doing national service, and our sense of the excitement and sophistication of the city would be hard to grasp for the current generation of students, accustomed as they are to media images of our instantly glamorous Western world. Those were the days, after all, when Coke was something you burned to keep warm. Although national service had given most of the boys some probably much needed maturity, and the young grew up fairly fast then, we weren't to know that we had long lives ahead of us. But for a student at that time, life was not really so different from that of the late 1930s, in spite of the socialist reforms made by the 1945 government, which perhaps only started to be understood and taken for granted in the 1960s. And as has so often been said, that decade didn't properly start until 1963. For example, food was still institutional. Elizabeth David, maybe you haven't heard of her, had only just started her glorious work, more radical than that of any of the eccentric foodies to whom we have now become accustomed. And perhaps it's worth mentioning that money was never mentioned. No one had any, so what was there to discuss? The Slade seemed to be a wonderfully classless society. Grants brought in by the Attlee government made it possible for almost anyone to get a free higher education. Many had to work to earn in the holidays, but even so, this opportunity hadn't existed before the war. Modernism was starting to wear thin until it was thoughtlessly retrieved in the disastrous building phase that swept the country in the early 1960s. The vast number of red brick Lego houses had not yet been built, and looking back at them now, 1950s council houses held a certain charm. Slightly pitched roofs, brick detailing here and there. This was a problem that had to wait nearly 50 years to be addressed. Bomb sites were then part of London's landscape. Now that the reality of air raids was fading in the public's consciousness, these ruins even had a certain glamour about them, a natural home for buddleier and small boys. When I started at the Slade, the students would be at work by 9:30 in the morning, unlike now, I think, and didn't take their first break until 11, when we had what passed for coffee. Like so many of my contemporaries, I didn't have my first real coffee until I was on a scholarship in Italy. I drank this new potion on the Piazza del Campo in Siena and have been trying to replicate it ever since. We often sat in some kind of shed, much of the teaching was done in sheds then, and listened to Mario Dubsky and Patrick Proctor compare their theatrical experiences of the night before. Neither we nor Mario himself realized that he was gay. That was hidden from our naive eyes, but there could never have been any doubt about Patrick. Most of us entered the Slade as singles and emerged 3 years later as doubles. Some, astonishingly, have succeeded in remaining so. Not me. When I traveled in the holidays with my student husband-to-be, I had to wear a wedding ring from Woolworths, otherwise we wouldn't have been able to share a hotel room, even in the cheapest and most miserable of places. We were, the majority of us, not just naive, but truly innocent, although simultaneously mature enough, having lived through a war, not to have to prove it through obligatory drunkenness. That is why the 1960s was such a shock to some and so liberating to others. The 1950s were pretty limiting, particularly for women who were being forced back into convention after their brief independence during the war. At lunchtime, we went to a cafe called the Hall of Mirrors, which is just off Gower Street, and had something called Vienna steak, minced patties with boiled potatoes for 3 shillings and 6pence. Mario, Yolanda Sonneborn, Michael Sandel, dressed in black, then as now, except then it was from Motorbike Oil and Litho Ink, and Janet Dawson, his exquisite and talented girlfriend, also my closest friend, who soon after returned to Australia, married a celebrity chef, and grew in sympathy with him until she approached his 26 stone. She made a successful career for herself there. 20 years later, we met again on my only trip to the Antipodes and were still happy to see each other. It was the only time in my life that I felt ashamed to be thin. She wore her body with such pleasure. The studios were divided up according to interests. The so-called Slade painters worked with the greatest possible intensity in the life room, long gone from most art schools now, I believe, and were almost without exception followers of William Coldstream, who was then professor. You painted what was in front of you, nothing else was needed. If you were really serious and committed, there was a small room in which a model posed every day for 6 weeks. I never attempted that. The model I remember best was the flame-haired Monica, who had the whitest and most beautifully female body I have ever seen. Later she married Coldstream, but only after he had taken a term off to sort out the turbulence that their relationship created. The marriage didn't last, although he adored the 3 children it produced and was often to be seen in the Slade office, which was then the center of all social activity and gossip. It looked rather fierce when I went in now. Exhausted and complaining about how long it took him to find a suitable pair of shoes for his eldest son. The most spectacular studio was probably the one run by Frank Auerbach in the tradition of David Bomberg, in which the air was dense with the charcoal they used in an attempt to understand and represent the solidity of space, a challenge to which Bomberg had dedicated himself. In my first year, there remained a space for those who wanted to work from casts and still lives. Downstairs, there were also rooms in which life classes were separated by gender, and even the models' breaks were staggered so that, God forbid, scantily dressed men and women didn't meet each other. But by the time I had been there a year or two, the American abstract expressionists had swept the country in a great wave of newness. Almost all working artists of whatever age were deeply affected by the exhibition of American art at the Tate in 1956 and 1959, and by Brian Robertson's marvelous curating, although then that word mostly referred to what the guards in public galleries did, of paintings by Jackson Pollock, Rothko, and others at the Whitechapel Gallery. The phrase that we students used, thinking we were incredibly perceptive, was expanding space. In other words, the canvas was no longer something to be looked into, like a window, but instead something to be absorbed, to surround us. This way of working required a great deal of paint, which didn't always sit well with our attempts to be true to traditional methods and make our own with dry pigments and a pestle and mortar. On one occasion, my husband-to-be, Mark Vaux, spent an entire morning patiently mixing, grinding, adding linseed oil, more mixing, more grinding, until finally, at the end of several hours, he had a neat heap of mixed paint. He then used it a la William Kooning, and with one sweep of his palette knife blew his morning's work. They were originals, those contemporaries of mine. We took art very seriously. We believed it was the noblest way of life you could choose. We were ambitious, but for our work, not for careers. Very few students ever imagined that they would have careers, certainly not in the way that is understood now. In his address to new students, Coldstream would told us that it would be wise to leave immediately and get proper jobs as bus conductors or seamstresses. There were a few exceptions. The worldly wise Ron Kittai, for instance, although he was both some 5 years older than the rest of us, and at the Royal College of Art, which had always been more commercially focused than the Slade. However, many of my generation have spent their lives as artists, a number of them successfully. 6 of my contemporaries are now Royal Academicians, all men apart from myself. Happily, this ratio is starting to change, although it may be some time until there is a proper balance of gender. We were all very important to each other and didn't take much notice of our tutors. Tutorials were held 3 times a term, lasted about 20 minutes, and only later became so-called deep structured conversations. Never again would our work get so much attention, but of course we didn't know this. My tutor was Andrew Forge, but I didn't appreciate his wonderful critical abilities until I left, after which it was too late. I still remember his very first words to me when I was 19. The problem with painting, he said, is knowing what to paint. Much truth in that. Our generation caught the last year of art history lectures by the late Ernst Gombrich. I learned later that his father had been my father's guardian in Vienna after my grandfather died in the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918, but I never met him. And we were also lectured to, sadly only once, by Anthony Blunt, on Poussin, of course. He took wicked pleasure in referring several times to the priapic. Afterwards, we had to go and look up what it meant. You may now already know what it means. All these things made a powerful impression on me. My fellow students, the introduction to the world of art, the opportunity to develop and understand the subject, the nature of art passion which lasts a lifetime. But perhaps what I remember most was the building itself. The soot-encrusted black exterior, which it was then, classic neoclassical, those glorious high-ceilinged, white-painted studios, the mysteries of the sculpture department in the basement, the grinding of the litho and etching plates in the print studios, the occasional great works of art on the walls, such as the Giacometti drawing, long since removed. I wonder who had the nerve and the foresight to remove it. The wide stone steps to the entrance, old, worn, gently rounded, leading straight ahead of you and then dividing right and left, they still carry the ghostly tread of the myriad students who have climbed them and, impossibly wonderful, of those who still do. Right. Now I have to press this. Right. I'm going to start with the first work I ever did when I was 5 years old. There are lots of things that are important to me about this. I actually believe I can remember painting it. I don't know whether it is a real memory or whether I've thought about it since, but I can actually remember sitting there, putting on the colors, and being incredibly proud of myself that I used the white of the paper as spaces. And actually, although occasionally I think this is the best painting that I've ever done, I think I was rather clever in doing that. So I really enjoyed that, and I then finished it, and I put my brushes down, and I stood back to admire my handiwork, and I had this terrible shock. The stripes on the left, I don't have to look around anymore, the stripes on the left and the stripes on the right didn't match up. I didn't know what had happened, and I didn't know how much this mattered. I was incredibly self-conscious about it, and I thought, perhaps somebody will notice, and the whole thing won't be worth anything, and I've just made a load of rubbish. Well, it's true, nobody ever noticed, nobody ever said anything about it. But what it started in my mind was the question of, what does truth have to do with art? How much do these things matter? And how much of oneself does one actually reflect in the work? And I think now I believe that any work that is truly one's own work is in some way a self-portrait. So what that actually means in terms of not getting it right, I don't really know. This is, some of you may have seen it, Masaccio in Florence. When I left the Slade, I got a scholarship to Italy, and it was probably the most defining and influential thing of my life. I had learned about I had learned about a lot of the paintings, but nobody had actually mentioned the architecture and the incredible power of Italian architecture. The paintings are rather mixed up. So this is a painting I actually did when I came back from my trip to Italy, which lasted 3 or 4 months. I've still got it, and I think it is still quite a good painting. And what I was trying to do was in some way replicate some of those spaces that I had experienced. But what's particularly interesting to me in this picture is to do with how I created this particular kind of space. Simply, I discovered by splitting the canvas in two, making a small perspectival movement, that I could actually get the space to move and change. And I think everybody knows all this now, but at the time that seemed like a very great revelation. I wrote something here about space. Let's see if I can find it. I can't find it, but this aspect of space, I think, is the thing that has kept me going and has interested me most, both in my own work and in other people's work. When you're making an artwork that uses space, what is that space? Where does it come from? Are you making more space in the world if you create something using some kind of perspective? Are you making an object? If it's an object, which I would say most people now think it is, how can it be an object and yet carry all those other things as well? So this was a very, very important question to me. And I have, in one way or the other, I think, been trying to manipulate space ever since, sometimes in very, very slight means, sometimes quite obviously. This is the Pazzi Chapel, Brunelleschi. I don't know how many of you have seen this, but I would strongly advise anybody who goes to Florence to go and have a look, because it is one of the most astonishing buildings in the world, where there is no art as such on the walls, but the space itself is completely unforgettable. The same with Piero the Flagellation. It's not a very good reproduction. I have to assume you all know this painting, and if you don't, I would like you all to go and see it immediately. You only have to go to Umbria to see it, or at least look it up, because I would say it's probably been one of the most influential paintings over the last 500-600 years, based on the golden section. I put up a Pollock because the Pollock exhibition came on at the Whitechapel when we were students here at the Slade, and it was absolutely mega. It was just the most amazing experience. Up until then, painting had more or less, and I'm concentrating on painting because that's what I am, and the Slade at that time was really painting and sculpture. Media hadn't yet been heard of. So painting was really painting and sculpture were the big things then. But painting was something relatively small. Painting was something you look through as looking through a window. And suddenly, here were these abstract expressionists where the work was absolutely surrounding you. So you became part of it, and we were all absolutely riveted and amazed. And I don't think I've ever been so amazed quite by anything since then. Again, one of my influences. What is interesting about these two is that the top vertical picture is of the castle, a ceiling in the castle in Prague, but the one below is actually at the Grand Mosque in Syria, in Damascus. So it is interesting how certain things repeat themselves through the ages. And so I continued to repeat these ideas. This was a painting from the 1960s. This is probably what Andy Stahl was referring to. What did you say? Whizzing around. Actually, that's quite interesting, because my intention had been to actually hold these elements in space, so they didn't whiz around. So I think if Andy remembers them as whizzing around, either I failed or I didn't see something that was there. But tension is, again, I always find it difficult to get involved in work that is sort of sloppy or flaccid. I always do demand some kind of tension in the work. This is a much more recent one. 2-3 years ago, I just called it 5 and 3, and they're two separate canvases, although in fact they're boards, not canvases. And this, I don't really terribly like the word motif, but perhaps this motif of triangles is also something that's run through the last 50 or 60 years. And I did a whole series of these, and what was interesting is it simply doesn't work upside down or side by side. It only works because there is a tension between the top 5 elements somehow either having dropped the lower 3 or pulling them up to be part of them. This was a work I did, it's quite a big painting, when I got together with a writer about 15 years ago. Some of you may have heard of him, W.D. Sebald. He became very famous after that, and then he died in a car crash. And he wrote the most wonderful books, and I responded to those books by taking short pieces from them and making an image in response to that. I included this because it's just part of scrapbooks and scraps of images that have been important to me. I expect everybody does that. That one, the top right, which says meter, is, I can't remember where, it's somewhere in Italy where they first defined what the dimensions of a meter should be. So if you think about measurements, it's quite an interesting subject, how we arrive at the measurements that we use now. You know, why do we say a foot? It can't be exactly because our feet are all that much the same, because they're not. So there's a whole history to that I went into once, and is worth following through. Now this, I'm sorry about the slide. Some of you may have seen this. This is perhaps my favorite building in the whole world, although I haven't seen it. It's in Iraq, in Samarra, and I'm sorry to say the Americans in the war chopped the top off it. So it's still there, but the top is just slightly sliced off. And it's built in a kind of spiral, and there are 2 other buildings in the world that relate to it. One in Cairo, and one I think also in Egypt somewhere, which I haven't seen. But there's something about this building that seems to me absolutely magical. Just made, it's the kind of thing that you would come up with if you take a piece of paper and just roll it up. So this painting actually was done before I had come across Samarra, but to me there is a connection. And here there is a connection because I simply took it as a subject. And this was a period when, this is not actually paint, this is printed paper. It's about so big. I would get paper colored and screen printed colored paper, and then I would send it to laser cutters, and they would cut this pattern holes into the surface of the paper. Then I would paint underneath and stick it down, and then weigh it down overnight. It's a very complicated and laborious process, and I'm actually very happy to have moved away from that now to oil paint. That's going back, this was 1980s. I did a whole series of works like this, but again, you have the triangles, which here are really, they're here through their absence, which is something I like the idea of very much, to get one to see something that is not exactly there. More scraps. This painting is called After Damascus, and about 7 years ago I was lucky enough to go to Syria, about only a year or 2 before the war started, And it was the most incredible place, and I did a series of works based really on the kind of colors that I saw and the pillars and the architecture. This was also to do with Damascus. There is a river that you don't see that runs underneath the city there, and so I call these river. And this, something's happened with this slide, but this is actually a very small painting, and it's the first I did of these series. The same technique of printing up colored paper. Printing is, I think it's a very, very, very pale pink underneath, and pressing it down. This is the cottage in Worcestershire where I grew up, and my family still have it. And I kept in touch with it. I still keep in touch with it. So, of course, the landscape there, I don't know if any of you know Worcestershire, is, I believe, the most beautiful in the country. It's soft and small-scaled and hilly and extraordinarily rich and rather out of fashion. You can't get to London and back in a day, so it's remained rather behind the times, which is, of course, what is so wonderful about it. So this painting and the next one, I suppose, must in some way have come from that. I think you can't be in touch with countryside over a whole lifetime without it not meaning a great deal. And in fact, there's no time to go into it here, but aspects of nature and the growth and the way growth develops, the Fibonacci series, all those things have been very, very important in my work. The earth round there in the springtime is deep, deep red, and I think that's what I was trying to get at. But perhaps you see what I mean by coming at something at a tangent rather than going directly for it. This is a painting this is done 3 years ago. My closest friend died, and it's also 2 panels. I called it Window for Caterina. I did a series where I had a door instead of this curved shape. And before she died, she did actually, I showed them in Newman Street, and she did actually get to see them, and she said she'd lay in bed and imagined herself going in and out of these, and that was really rather wonderful for me. This painting also, 3 or 4 years old, I did a whole series, and I called it Migration. I think you can see, for obvious reasons, the same old triangles again, but perhaps now the word migration is beginning to mean something different. Okay, the last few, because we've haven't got as long as I had hoped to talk. This is in Aleppo, and it's very typical of a number of entrances they have there. And what's that piece called? I can't remember what it's called. There is a name, the lintel really, that goes over an entrance. And ever since I saw these, they've been on my mind, and I've been wondering how I could actually deal with these, how I could somehow make a painting that spoke about these places. And these are some of the ones that I've now come up with. And of course now the name Aleppo means something very, very different. And I've called them Remembering Aleppo. And although I wouldn't call them political works, and I have always been a little bit suspicious of most political works, probably most of you don't agree, mainly because however wonderful a piece of art a political work is, it is never actually going to make any difference to the circumstances. Nevertheless, I have felt obliged to do this, and I'm still, this is my studio at the moment, and you can't really see, but these are panels. They're not that big, perhaps that high and this wide. And I'm using oil paint, and so I can actually go on and on and on, putting on more and more coats of paint. And I'm calling them all Remembering Aleppo. And that's a very, very small one, and that's the last one. It is, you can't quite see it, but it is quite three-dimensional in its effect. And the way the triangles have changed here, they move, as you move around it, it somehow moves. So I will probably be going on doing these, and I think I've talked too long. Can we put lights on? Thank you. Now, questions, or I'll just say I went to give a talk at Norwich last week, and of course, students didn't want to say anything. And then one boy would stand up and he said, the trouble with being an art student now is that there's no discipline. He said, we can just do what we want. So I asked him, I said, well, would you prefer to be told to draw or paint 3 apples for 3 weeks? And he said, yes, he would. And there was a girl there, she said, no, that would be awful. She said, you know, we have freedom now. So they had this very interesting conversation, so that some people wanted more discipline, some people wanted less. So I would be very, very interested to know how you feel, what your concerns are. Pick on a talker, Andy. Pick on someone who you can't shut up normally. Do you disagree with anything I've said? You must do.
No, not necessarily. I have nothing to say.
You have nothing to say? What are you doing? What are you doing here? Painting, sculpture?
I'm in media.
You're media.
I was just wondering if we could see any of your works
Um,
anyway. Just because you said they were painted on board rather than on canvas or linen.
You'd have to, at the moment, you'd have to go up to Norwich. But I hope to be showing the next couple of years. Is that a good thing to have nothing to say if you're a media student, or a bad thing?
I think it's a good thing.
You were asking if you could actually see them somewhere, which is always much better.
Of course.
Always much better than seeing a painting on a screen. And I was just wondering, what's your relationship to that, seeing your paintings on a screen? And maybe like some of your work has preempted like computer graphic imagery. Like it looks kind of similar when you see it on a screen, but it's nothing like that in real life. How do you feel about that?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's a big problem. My work is never reproduced well. And there's certain things you just have to accept. That, you know, there's certain artists. Think of Roy Lichtenstein. How can you go wrong? I'm not saying he's not a very important artist, but there are quite a lot of artists whose work looks absolutely wonderful in reproduction. Mine doesn't. And what you say about, you know, the laser cutting and so on is one has to be very, very careful, because if I can do something with the technology, that means anybody else can, and therefore it can be used for all kinds of other means which we don't want. And I'm of a generation where the thumbprint is very important. But you can't pretend these things haven't happened. And avant-garde materials take different forms over different periods. You know, in the 16th century, oil paint was the new thing. It was a very exciting thing to use. When I was a student, masking tape was high technology. And that isn't that long ago. So
that it's impossible to look at it on a screen, so it actually insists on seeing it in person and like a sense of physicality.
well, I think that's a very nice view to take, and I think I would agree with it. Yes, there is no way actually of communicating that other than by the object. Are you a painter? Oil paint? Yeah. Well, that's 2 of us, anyhow.
One place we can always see your work is at the Royal Academy in the summer show.
Oh, yes, I'd forgotten about that.
And also, but you've regularly shown in London, so it's not like it's around.
Well, My work doesn't get shown all that often. The Royal Academy Summer Show is a problem. I don't know if you've ever been, because it is a bazaar. But probably worth going to have a look, because, you know, there are over 1,000 works together. In fact, I heard a rather interesting story about Picasso, who showed in the Salon, and somebody asked him, what does your work look like in the Salon? And he said, words to the effect, it looks bloody awful. But he said, the difference between me and the other artists is that I know why it looks bloody awful, but they don't. Can somebody tell me what they think is different now from what art school was like a number of years ago? I mean, you do all have an extraordinary freedom. You can do whatever you like. Is that good or bad? Debt, did you say? Yeah. Well, you're all very brave being here. But I suppose you're... I can't help you there. I'm told nobody pays it off.
There's more than the two, there's a lot of commissions.
Yes. I have, for the last 30 years, in fact, I have done what's called public work, which when I started doing it, really was an extension of what architects do, except done by an artist who had a different take on things. So my interest really has been in place, in being able to affect the difference, affect differences in places. I think that also came from Italy, where they have such a wonderful sense of a place, and a place in relation to an individual, right to the extent of, they say that they have fountains there, not just because of hot climate, but it also meant that people could talk quietly and not be overheard. The whole shape of so-called public art has changed, and now, on the whole, it tends to be much more temporary, which probably is quite a good thing. I thought there'd be a lot of artists like me who really wanted to work with architects, but actually there haven't been very many. And I happen to think something like, let's say, Trafalgar Square is a really good idea, because it's there for whatever, a year and a half, and I always feel that you can put up with almost anything if you know it's not going to be there forever. So, but I don't think this is quite the place to go into the public work without slides. It's too difficult to grasp.
You spoke a little bit about when you were at the Slade in the 50s and kind of the gender expectations of that time and how that kind of worked on a practical level in terms of, like, you know, life models and being in partners. And I just wondered if you would like to say anything about whether the interpretation or kind of critical approach to the sort of the work men and women were making there, whether, like, as a female painter, people tried to project certain kind of...
Could you say that last bit again?
Whether as a female painter, people tended to project sort of feminine qualities onto your work or not, or whether you felt like the work itself kind of rose above gender questions.
It's a very complicated question.
Sorry.
And a lot of words have been written about it.
But just personally, in your own kind of experience.
Oddly enough, I didn't feel that pressure very much as a student, because at the time I just thought people were being very nice about the work. The word patronizing hadn't actually appeared at that time. So later on, I looked back and I thought, well, you know, they could afford to be nice about it because more or less you weren't quite in the running if you were female. And then, of course, everything did change. And by the time Germaine Greer had written The Obstacle Race, not The Obstacle Race, what was the... Thank you, The Female Eunuch, which was what, about 1970, 71, a lot of things changed. When I went to teach in 1968 at the Slade, I was the first female teacher there. And I actually got the job because I was talking to one of the teachers at a party, and he said, oh, you must come in and do a day's teaching. And I said, yes, I'd love to. And then I woke up the next morning and I remembered that William Coldstream had said, so long as I am professor here, no woman will set foot over the threshold teaching. So I rang this bloke, it's Willie Townsend. I said, I can't possibly come in with, you know, Bill having said that. He said, oh, don't take any notice of that, you come in. And so I did, and then a few more and a few more, and lo and behold, amazingly wonderful, I've heard the odd complaint there are too many women teaching there now. And I think that's a terribly good sign. There is absolutely no doubt that for women in the art world, things have improved hugely. Further than that, it's difficult to say. It's difficult to say. It is, all round, it's an advantage if you happen to be a bloke. And probably an advantage if you happen to be white, Western bloke. We all know that now. Was I?
Thank you.
I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how the speed of information exchange, or just generally the speed of things in society, has affected art making, and also in your experience how it's affected your practice.
Oh, that's a very interesting, difficult one. It's affected everybody. It's affected everybody in terms of ordinary life. I suspect it's gone a bit too fast now. I mean, it happens, I think it's probably happened with every generation. But now it is so fast that we all wonder about, you know, whether this is any good, whether it's replacing something else. I have a granddaughter, and she says when she's together with her, she's give or take your age, when she's together with friends, they're sitting around a table and they actually communicate through their mobiles. I don't know, that may be no bad thing. I don't think it's a very good thing, but I can't be absolutely certain. I mean, I'm even on bad terms with my mobile. I haven't got much further than that. I can use the computer, but really rather badly. How it's affected my work? Well, the technical developments for art have probably been rather wonderful. I think laser cutting, for instance, is absolutely fabulous. I mean, that image, which has turned chocolate brown now, if you imagine what it would take to actually saw a piece, it's actually quite difficult, because I get that done for me, and I sent off the drawing to this girl who does it, and said, what would this cost? And she came back, she said, well, about £400. So I said, well, I don't want it gold-plated, but she was talking about the time it would have taken her to have cut these two pieces small by hand. As it is, they were laser cut and cost about £12. So I think in that sense, that is wonderful. I personally can go through a huge amount of information in my own work on the computer. I now don't draw with a pencil anymore, which means the drawings are not as interesting. I mean, you know, we can all draw on the computer. They cannot be, but you can't go back. You can't go back, ever, with anything. But what it does mean is that I used to have to paint out stuff again and again and again to see if it was right until I got it right. Now I can actually, in 10 minutes, I can go through what would have taken 10 years otherwise. So I would say it's both very good and not so good.
Hi, yeah, just on that, I was going to ask about the laser cutting process, and what was the point that you first decided to start using that technology, and why?
Wait a minute, yes, I think I do remember. It was something to do with wanting the surface of the canvas to have the same resonance that I could get from a screen print, because a screen print, if you have just one coat or maybe two coats, it's got the white of the paper behind it, which gives it a wonderful base. Now, you can get that with painting, but there was just something with some of the prints I was doing that was very, that I really wanted. But then how would I make a mark? And then I thought, I want an edge. It's difficult to remember. I think the blue painting, which had many sort of rows of little squares coming to a point that I showed you, those were actually painted on. And then I realized I actually wanted an edge that was just a little bit less messy than anything you could get painted on, and with slightly more depth. So somehow I must have learned about laser cutting, that it could be done like that.
I wanted to respond about what you said, the students discussed about discipline and how much freedom there is. I was just thinking, so you said the student said he would like to paint apples in
Yes.
3 weeks.
Yes.
I think three weeks is a bit much. Maybe 1 week would be good. What I personally think about discipline is that because I'm here and we're doing degrees, and I try to compare that with other degrees, and you know, in the same university, and all degrees are academic, I believe, and I think there's so much you have to do in order to complete a degree, and that's what makes a degree. And without discipline, it might be quite hard to quantify how much you do and how good it is to get a degree. So, I mean, I don't have a very good conclusion, but that's what I think.
So you're saying you feel more discipline would be helpful to you personally?
I think some would be good, and
But you see, art is a very, it's not an academic subject, is it? It's not something that you can learn and then you know it. And if you go through art school and you haven't found a way of disciplining yourself, and you haven't found a way of learning to concentrate, which I think is more important than anything else, then you're probably better off doing something else, or doing something that relates to the subject but is not directly creative. Because to be an artist, in my view, to be a real artist means continuing this through a whole lifetime. And you can only do that if you haven't really got much choice. If you have to do it. You just have to, you're impelled to do it. And you can only do that if you have the ability to discipline yourself and learn to concentrate. So in a way, I would say the freedom that you have is also the freedom to discipline yourself. I don't know what people say here, but if you wanted to work on a plate of 3 apples for 1 week, I would be surprised if there wasn't a tutor that wouldn't take that seriously and engage with you. Am I wrong? And I personally be really interested to see what one would do actually in 3 weeks. You know, probably drive you crazy after 1 week, and then you'd be forced to find resources in your imagination and so on. When I was a student once at St. Martin's, we put in a room and they threw a whole pile of cardboard, a huge pile of cardboard boxes, and we worked on them we drew from them for 3 days. And what it meant was I never ever after that had any problem with learning how to push things back in space or perspective and so on. Get them to do it.
I definitely do agree with the. I guess with disciplines there are different types, and self-discipline would be a good one for students like us.
I mean, it's not so easy to go in your studio every day when there are nicer things you can do, or indeed be kept away, having to earn money when that's what you do want to do. It's not an easy life. If you want an easy life, I would say what Colson did, get out fast. Yes? Oh my God. Nobody's asked that kind of question for a long time. I think it's ridiculous. But, you know, many things are ridiculous in the way we have to live our lives. And there it is. I wouldn't take too much notice of it, and I wouldn't worry too much about getting a first or a 2-1 or whatever. If you're going to do the work, you'll do the work. I wouldn't have dared to say that when I was here, of course.
Maybe one more question.
Yeah, you didn't like that one, did you, Andy?
Thanks very much, Tess.
Thank you, Andrew.